Good evening, friends, and welcome to tonight, our third and last session of this seminar called Hand in Hand, Aging Together in the Spirit. We are glad you're here again. It's delightful to have so many of you come back and join us. And um, we know that it requires a certain amount of courage and honoring the vulnerability and the reality of all of us aging and dying eventually. We are hoping the conversation in your hearts and in your families is broadened because of our work here. Um, Tonight's topic is about continuing relationships after death or beyond death. I am Patty Nesbitt. I'm the clerk of the Baltimore Yearly Meeting End of Life Working Group. And I'm joined here tonight again with two dear friends, also members of our working group. Kristen Zimmett from Hopewell Center meeting out in Winchester, Virginia, and Eileen Stancione from Patapsco Friends meeting here in nearby in Columbia, Maryland. Eileen's talking tonight. As you know, we've rotated the leadership here. Eileen is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked for years in dialysis and in hospice as a social worker, helping families and clients, patients to discern the right direction and to fill some of the needs they have. She's most interested in grief and bereavement. When there's a question about grief, we turn to Eileen, although I found her helpful in lots of other ways too. Eileen has served in multiple capacities, clerking, most recently our Baltimore Yearly Meetings Ministry and Pastoral Care. And I think you're right now a co-clerk again of Patapsco meeting.
It'll be soon.
So
Yeah.
will be soon. Okay. I mean, it seems like a rotation. As you know, we all rotate through these roles, and Eileen's gotten this one down, and they're lucky to have her. So, why don't you go ahead and we will have a breakout group after some presentation tonight, and then there will be more queries to guide your questions and conversations. Um, and let's go on. Eileen, you can take it away from here. Thank you. We're glad you're here.
Oh, thank you, Patty, and thank you for your kind words. It's been such an honor to work with both Kristen and Patty. I just really have enjoyed it. Tonight, I wanted to talk about how death is not the end of a relationship. And some of the key points are a relationship is a connection, a link between loved ones, and we can choose to be in relationship with our loved ones even after they die. Love transcends death. And this is because the meaning of a relationship and the love one has for the person who died continues. Death changes our physical relationship with one another. Death changes a relationship, but it need not end it. When a loved one dies, one can continue that person's legacy. And when I was thinking about that very last item, when a loved one dies, one can continue that person's legacy. I was thinking of my grandmother. She actually died when she was only 60 years old. And I was just a child at the time. And my family just adored her. So, of course, as a little one, I understood that and adored her as well. And she was richly deserving of it. I'm still in a relationship with my grandmother, even though she died so long ago. I behave in ways that validate that I am not finished being her granddaughter. It is part of my ongoing relationship with her to care for people as she would. The legacy of her values and what I do with that legacy is an ongoing gift that links me to her and maintains her presence in my life today. I look for ways to maintain her values and her gentle way of being, the way I love my family and my role as a social worker. It is empowering to maintain a relationship with her, no matter how private or invisible. It is personal real, and meaningful. The emotional bond is intact and strong even after her death many years ago. Transforming relationships means learning to integrate our deceased loved ones in a new way. We learn how to weave our loved ones and their values into a new life without them. But through love, we can always be in relationship with them. So, how do we connect with those that have passed? What are the continuing bonds? The most obvious ones that I could think of was holding on to our loved ones' possessions. As a social worker in both dialysis and hospice, one of the things that I noticed that was really remarkable is how variable people are about hanging on to belongings of the person who died. Some people couldn't wait to get the belongings out of the home. They wanted to do it within weeks of the passing. And I think for them, if I could speak for them, because it's certainly not, I don't want to make a generalization, but it seemed as if they just couldn't bear to have the clothes, for example, in the closet. They didn't want to see the dress that their grandmother or mother wore at a particular event. It was easier for them just to have an empty closet. And then there were others who really, it was very interesting, particularly if a child died, a young child, the room where that child, that bedroom was preserved as if it were a shrine. And you could go to that home 3 years later and it would look exactly the same. So it really varies, just like grief varies, the way we grieve, everybody's very different from one another. And that's true for this as well. It's very fascinating. So another common continuing bond is maintaining rituals that you shared with your loved one. That could be birthday dinners, you know. Some people will make the person's favorite food and then invite friends and family to share in the food and all the bounty and to have fun and talk about the person. And that certainly is another way of continuing that bond. And finally, continuing to visit places that you used to visit together. I know many of the people here in Maryland, they might go to Ocean City together or Deep Creek Lake. They might rent a home for a weekend, and they might even have the person that passed on, they might be honoring them that weekend and talking about them, perhaps at the 1 year anniversary. So there's all different kinds of ways. So some additional continuing bonds are talking to your deceased loved one. This is something which I think has become more common with people being more frequently cremated. And if they have the cremains in an urn and they have it in their home, perhaps on a bookshelf, they may come into that room and sit there and talk with the person. My sister does it. Her husband died 5 years ago, and she'll sit and talk with him about decisions she's trying to make. And she doesn't receive an answer, but on the other hand, she feels comfort. It's really helpful to her. So that's a very common way to do it. And imagining what your loved one would say. Can you imagine what your loved ones might say about our election? It'd be quite an experience. So you can imagine what would my brother-in-law think about that? And displaying photos of your loved one is another way to continue the bond. One of the sad things that happens, I think, with people, especially after the years go by, after the death, is that a person begins to lose the image of their loved one. They forget what the voice sounded like. So having photos is incredibly important. And also voicemail, like a person could play it over and over and over again. And it's like the person is right there with you. And I've taken to suggesting that to people, that if they're with a person who's doesn't have long to live, they may want to do that because that would be a way of bringing that person into their lives. Um, and then incorporating your loved one into events and special days, and making your loved one proud. Often people will engage in all kinds of worthy efforts, and they think, well, what would he have to say about this, or what would she have to say about that? I'm sure she would be very, very proud of me. Um, and sometimes too, people will create events like a relay, a race, so that they can receive donations for the number of miles each person runs, and give it to an organization that's researching cancer, let's say. So it's something that is very common and very, very helpful. So, Patty, do you have an example of how you keep a deceased loved one alive if you do?
Well, yeah, we keep we keep getting together for my mom's birthday. One of the examples that you gave. There were 10 of us. Well, there still are 10 of us actually, brothers and sisters, and usually 7 to 9 people or 8 people show up. My sister Ann doesn't come back from Australia for this. She comes other times of the year and we celebrate mom. Um, but we get together for her birthday, and my Catholic brothers and sisters still go to mass, and so we'll do that together. It was one of the family rituals. We tell mom stories, and it's fun. Yeah,
Good,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you, Patty. What about you, Kristen?
So there are many, many ways that I practice connection to my darling who died 5 years ago. But one of them that I'd like to add is in meeting for worship. In silent worship is where I feel that all beings are one. They connect, and it's very easy for me to find him there. Um, and a couple weeks ago, I was entering a challenging medical situation where I was helping friends. And in meeting for worship, I reached out to John and said, I need your qualities. I need your steadiness. I need your lightheartedness. And these are not qualities that are automatically typical of me in any situation. I tend to be the fierce lioness. Um, I tend to be a little volatile. And so I asked him to be present in me in those ways. And I felt an affirmation come back. And I went forth with the sense that I was companioned, I was accompanied.
No, it's lovely. Thank you. All right, so we'd like to go into breakout rooms now. Um, so, Francis, how are we going to do this? Now, does everybody know what we'll be doing? There's a query that will be in the chat, a couple of queries, and that's what you can reference. We'll have about 15 minutes, and there'll be 3 people in each group. Here we go. Thank you.
Maybe you can read the queries aloud as I'm creating the breakout groups.
Okay. The first one is, do you keep a deceased loved one with you, and in what ways? Have you continued to be in relationship with them, and if so, how? Have you felt their presence through one sense or another, and what is that like for you? hope that was fruitful for you. And I wish I could hear some of your responses, but it's just we have a condensed amount of time, so we have to keep moving along. So now I want to talk about commemoration. And that's the acts of commemoration that honor that of God within us and the person who died, and comfort those lives are changed by death. So, what does it mean to commemorate life? Basically, to remember a person who's died by means of a special action, a ceremony, or a special created object. And why is that important? The coming together of friends and family and colleagues and sometimes strangers brings a sense of belonging and community spirit. What are some of the emotional benefits of having a memorial service, having a celebration, having a funeral? For one thing, it's really helpful in terms of embracing emotion. Many people who are bereaved after the death are so busy getting ready for the service, the funeral, the memorial service, and so busy taking care of details, because oftentimes they have to get death certificates, et cetera, that they are so busy doing that they don't feel. And having something just for the expression of the love and respect that people pay the one that died can really open up somebody who's been very closeted in. I have seen so many times that the bereaved will be standing in a certain area and somebody will come up to them and they'll get tears in their eyes. And by the time they're together, they're hugging and crying and sobbing because it just feels so wonderful to the understanding that goes on between those two people about the loss. Because oftentimes the bereaved's friends, the bereaved's Quaker meeting friends, that this is something that is so precious and so private that it can be felt between the two people. Sharing consolation, harnessing collective strength. Well, I keep thinking of this recent memorial service we had at Patapsco. One of our members, Jan Warner, died, and her daughters wanted to have the service at our meeting house. And they did, and it was beautiful. People got up and gave messages about Jan, and it was very, very special. And then afterwards, they had some food and socialization at one of the daughters' homes. And it was so interesting to me because the people that were new to Quakerism really were enamored the way we handled it, the messages that we have. And several people told me in secret that they wish that they could have Quaker for themselves. And I understand exactly what they were saying. I wish they could too. So healing through ritual certainly is a wonderful way to the wonderful emotional benefit of a memorial. And I think for many religions and cultures, the rituals are incredibly important when someone has died. It brings great comfort. And oftentimes it doesn't require a tremendous amount of thought. This is something that you can move into. You've done it many times, these rituals, and it's something you can move right into and get the feeling, and it feels really good. Providing closure. I thought that was an interesting note that I discovered in this one booklet. I don't know about closure. I don't know how you feel about it. I think that it's possible at a memorial service and afterwards to feel some closure. But I think that closure is not something that's easily won. It could take years or months. Depends very much on the person. Just like grief is very individualistic, so is that sense of closure and feeling comfort that this is all I could do. This is all I could do for them. And they're in a good place right now. So it's interesting. I have a lot of thoughts about closure and connecting to spirituality. As I said earlier, we have this belief that there is that of God in each one of us. And if you believe that and believe in an afterlife, as I do, when you've been racked with illness and feeling a lot of pain and suffering, many people are ready for death, and it becomes as a great comfort to them. And I think also it's a freeing of the body, letting it go and becoming one with spirit. So that's certainly a wonderful benefit for the memorial services, because it helps you to connect with the spirit. So death rituals. There's a lot to this. It really involves everything's so different with different cultures and different religions. So it's hard to try to understand it, but it certainly is fascinating to study it. One of the things I got into when I was preparing for this was I had no idea there was something called a pre-burial vigil. And that's basically a time when people sit with the body. And it might be for 3 hours or could be for 3 days. But and apparently that part of the Catholic Church, some sects of the Catholic Church will engage in this. So it's a way of giving prayers, blessings, intercessory prayers, poetry, scripture. All of those things can go on during these pre-burial vigils. And certainly a very common one is preparing the body. You might have community members preparing it, or family members, or as in the tradition of having the funeral director's staff take care of the body. That's all very much a death ritual. And burial, of course, is the most traditional of all of our death rituals. This is what many of us do after a person has died, is to have a burial and often have a service right there at the gravesite. Cremation has become much more understood and appreciated. I think for some people, the cost is so much less than a regular funeral. It might be the reason why they chose to be cremated. When I worked at hospice, we had some people that had very little money and didn't have the money to have a funeral. And there were some people that actually were refrigerated for a month until GoFundMe's and other ways could gather enough funds. So the cremation was a very excellent alternative for that. And Kristen, did you have a story about cremation?
Yes, I do. When my dear John was taken for cremation, I found that I needed a bridge, a ritual bridge between that body that I loved and the ashes they were going to give back to me in a box. I needed to connect them in some way, and there was no ritual in my culture. So I supplied one, and I made the funeral home promise me that the moment that they began to put his body into burn, they would call me. I would know the exact time, and I would know when it completed. And I had a friend on standby, and when they called me, I called her quickly, and we gathered, we lit a candle, and I took John's guitar and I sang his favorite songs. He was a mighty folk singer. And we sang his songs and the stories around his singing and celebrated him with the candle burning. And all the time that his body burned down, his spirit burned upward into our hearts.
Oh, lovely. Very nice story. Thank you. How about you, Patty? Oh, you're on mute.
Mute.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Had to figure out, I thought I had to wait for Francis to do it. Thank you. Okay. Um, I've been really taken with the work that has been going on at Lancaster Friends Meeting in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They've had an ongoing death care committee, um, and they prepare the bodies of the people who've contracted with them for green burials. I'm impressed with the idea of green burials and having a home-based death ritual. I found out when writing this book that it is not required in Maryland to have a funeral director. Um, should I want to put a body in my car, it's legal and could carry the body, from A to B and um, and prepare the body and bury it. In Sandy Spring, we have a graveyard, so it's feasible that we, as friends, could create our own circle of death supporters, death care supporters, individuals who would take care of this. I have been involved with a home death where the woman who died was a biodynamic farmer, and she followed Rudolf Steiner protocols for lots and lots of things in her life. And when Miriam died, we iced her body with dry ice and kept her body in the same bed, washed her body, cleaned her, kept her clean for 4 days because the biodynamic folks felt that, or I guess the Steiner folks felt that the soul leaves the body slowly. Um, and then we had made a shroud, um, created a shroud. One of the local folks in our community, a friends, this was not a friend as in Quaker friends group, but a very tight rural community. And Greg made the box and um, um, Chris dug the hole with his backhoe, and her son-in-law was a violinist and who played at the Kennedy Center. He was good. And we processed her in this box out into the field and buried her. Um, it was a powerful, powerful service where we all had a chance to observe Miriam's soul, if you will, leaving the body slowly. I can say, having worked in the hospital and seen many, 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 many deaths, that the body seems to let go of the soul slowly. We had Buddhists in the hospital that wanted us not to touch the body for 8 hours, and different rituals, different groups had different number of hours or days. And in the hospital, when we were not backed up and people and waiting for a room in the emergency room, we allowed that to the degree we possibly could so that their rituals were honored. There too, they didn't want anyone to touch the body while the soul was moving out of the body. It was powerful. I should say that there are many friends in other parts of the world who do the same about death care. I understand there's a group in Silo, North Carolina too. Yeah. We
Oh,
can talk
very
about green
interesting.
burials another time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Patty. Appreciate it. All right. So as you can see, there's many death rituals, and just a few others are, of course, there's prayers just for the dying and those that have died. And that's a lovely thing. And there's poetry, there's songs. We have so many rituals. Oftentimes there's a mourning period. I know the Jews have the first year is a very special year of mourning. And in Italy, years ago, when we were there, you would see older women dressed in black. And apparently there was some kind of a cultural thing where people would dress in black for a year. So every culture and people within those cultures all have very different ways of honoring the dead through ritualistic behaviors. And then there's celebratory events. One of the things that's just come about in recent times, which I think is delightful, and that is that people have a celebratory event before the person dies. You know how sad it is when you hear all these wonderful things about a person at a funeral or memorial service, and you wish the person could have heard it? Well, people have taken that one step further, and they actually do it, where they make sure that the person is well enough that they can really appreciate what's been said about them and that they've been honored and respected. It usually has very good consequences. Okay, here comes one of my favorite subjects, making meaning out of the death. To me, I always try to understand things as just by nature. And I think that if I can understand something that as a result of the death, something that was meaningful about it, it brings me great comfort. I recently went to a day-long seminar with David Kessler. Now, David Kessler worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, as you know, wrote The 5 Stages of Death. Well, David Kessler wrote a book with her called Grief and Grieving. And one of the things that he has come up with in recent years is the 6th stage of death and grieving. And that is finding meaning in the death. So, you know, he actually I read that book and I devoured it. It was so good. And also, I remember saying to people that went to that seminar that I could listen to that man for hours. He was mesmerizing, talking about death and dying and what happens afterwards. So in his attempt to try to find meaning after a shattering loss, he lost his son. He had 2 sons. He lost one of them, and he had already lost his parents. So David Kessler talked about Viktor Frankl. If you recall, he was a writer who wrote during the period after World War II. He was actually in a concentration camp. And one of the things that he came up with in Man's Search for Meaning, his book that he wrote, is the ability to choose how we respond to the most terrible of circumstances. And what could be more awful than being in a concentration camp? Not having enough to eat, to wear, watching people die. So he believes, this is Viktor Frankl now, that everything can be taken away from a person but one thing, and that's to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Frankl's work shed light on human suffering, on how life's most challenging moments can produce reliance, courage, creativity, and meaning. Our worst moments can be the seeds of our best moments. Now, I understand that there may have been no one else in that concentration camp that came to the understandings that he did. But what he came up with, I think is very, very helpful. Because if you can find some meaning in a death, it can help you to tolerate it. Because it's something that, with a shattering loss, it's very hard to even imagine going on. So this is something that he could really relate to. So some people will find meaning in a belief in an afterlife, and others will find meaning in the memories of their loved ones. David Kessler found great meaning in knowing that he had turned great loss the loss of his son for one, into a vocation that had helped thousands survive the worst moments of their lives. And I really believe that. And one of the things that I wanted to tell you about in terms of this very subject is my 35-year-old nephew, Bob, died on the golf course on Good Friday. And he was like my oldest son. He taught my boys, I have 3 sons, how to play golf, how to play basketball, video games. He was just an absolute delight. The last time Bob and I were together, it was my birthday. And we were sitting and talking in the den of my home. And he said to me, you know, I could sit and talk with you all day. And I never forgot that. You know, he left me with that gift. And I think one of the things that provided meaning for me in that death, that horrible death, which was really needless if you knew the story, was that I understood at a very deep level, probably for the very first time in my life, how life can be very, very short. You know, it can be gone in an instant. And that happens over and over throughout the world in all these horrible wars that we get involved with and others do. So when I came to that understanding, I realized that it was time for me to think about what my priorities were. And one thing I always wanted to do was to go back to school. And I wanted to go back to school so I could teach in graduate school. So I did. I enrolled in a PhD program, and it really was because of Bob. I am very grateful that that's one thing that came out of it, because I really have enjoyed teaching. So it's that kind of a thing that David Kessler talks about, how something can come out of a really tragic situation that can bring light to your life and love to your life, and an understanding that's just incredible. Legacy, that's another subject that I wanted to address. Everyone has a legacy, right? Don't you have a legacy, Kristen? You know, there are practical kinds of legacies. We deal with wills and we deal with possessions, as I mentioned earlier. And there's our legacy in the broader sense. Our genes, our energy, our outreach, our good works, our friendships, and all the things that we have done. And as is stated in A Tender Time, the world is wholly different because you have been in it. Isn't that lovely? The world is wholly different because you have been in it. And that's true for the one who has died and the one who is bereaved. And then moving on to something that's a little more difficult, I think. One of the things that is a continuing bond is that sometimes there's harm that has been done. So sometimes as a result of a death, you can have resolution of harm, or at least in part. I had worked with a woman who had a young woman, daughter. She was in her 20s, early 30s, and she was dying of cancer. And you know, one of the mother's duties, and she was an incredible care provider, one of her duties was to wash the woman each morning. And she had gotten into a routine where she took care of it, and she was very gentle, very compassionate. And she was washing her daughter, and her daughter tried to get her attention, and she couldn't get her attention because the woman was so consumed by this task. You know how you get when you're in the middle of something, you want to finish it. Well, that's what happened with her. And when she was all done with the task, she looked up and her daughter was silent and her chest was no longer going up and down. Her daughter had died during that moment, those moments. And she was absolutely apoplectic. It was so hard for her. The guilt that this woman felt that she couldn't acknowledge whatever it was that her daughter wanted to say to her. So, what's the resolution of harm? Getting a perspective that she was an incredible caregiver. And her daughter certainly said that to anybody who would listen. It was something that couldn't be helped. It was a mistake, basically. And everyone makes mistakes. It was at a critical time in this young woman's life. But I'm sure she would understand. And I conveyed that to the mother many times. And it took her a while, but she began to feel less and less pain and less suffering because of it. So there's a variety of harms that have been done to people during their lives that hopefully can be remediated while they're still living. Many people have talked to me about, things that they have done that they really regretted. I had worked with a number of Vietnam vets, and some of them just poured their hearts out to me about what happened in Vietnam. And they just felt so bad about it. And men who had never cried in their lives, except of course when they were a child, were deeply wounded and would cry when they would tell me about it. That was a resolution of harm. It was so helpful to them. We send our boys to these wars, and they do it because of love of country. And that was what he was doing and what all of them were doing. So it's the kind of thing where, the harm can be partially remediated, but it takes time. And sometimes it can take a lifetime. And then after the death, there's still time. There's still time. So let's see, where are we? It's a little bit after 8 o'clock. And we would like to have you ponder some queries and also to come back in 10 minutes and talk about what more you'd like to hear about from people like us and what kinds of actions has this workshop prompted you to take. Those kinds of things we'll talk about. But if you could just take 5, 7, or 8 minutes to think about what meaning you have found in the death of a loved one, that would be most helpful. So you could do this quietly on your own, much like our 2-minute reflections that we had in some of our sessions. And we'll call you back a quarter after. Thank you. might wish to take notes about this too, if you'd like. That might be helpful to go back to afterwards. And then Patty, whenever you're ready to do the wrap up, you can just break in, okay?
I'm seeing a number of people that do not seem to be writing anymore. Are friends ready to come back and have more of a general conversation? I think I think the answer is yes. From the heads I see shaking. Okay, well let's do that then. This is the last evening we're doing this conversation, and I wanted to throw the floor open for a little bit. If there are any burning questions, and we have questions ourselves too. We'd like to know what topics you would like for further conversation and discussion, and what else you'd like to go on to explore. And we'd also like to know, get some feedback from you about, has this made differences to you? Have you made any uh, plans, changes in your own plans, perhaps in your advanced directive, or beginning to think about one, or in your sense of how you want to go about your own process? So we really appreciated so many of you coming and sharing your perceptions with each other, and invite you to continue the conversation in any way that works for you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be well. Be well.